I really think the whole thing that there was a fighting game, Dark Ages, is half poppycock, half I can get it. Because people talk about the 10 years, so they basically go from like 1999 to 2009. I kind of don't like to start at 1999 because CVS2 came out in 2001. So I feel like that's kind of unfair to start it at to basically start it at 99 after Street Fighter Alpha. I mean, Third Strike. So people like to basically go from the last Street Fighter and be like, the last Street Fighter was this, was the last time the scene was busting. No, we had CVS2 that came out. So like we go started at I basically go from 2002 to 2009. And if you look during that time, it was a bunch of it was like some pretty hot games that was released during that time. If you started 2001, you got Dead or Alive 3 came out. Then you had KOF 2001 that came out. And basically, every year you got a KOF. So, people can go back and forth about, if they like the KOF for that year. Then in 2002, you had Virtual Fighter 4. You had Soul Calibur 2 that came out, a top 3 fighting game of all time. Ask your mom about it. MK Deadly Alliance came out. Guilty Gear X, well, E. How do you say Guilty Gear with the two X's? Can you just
Oh,
say
we always say,
XX? Or?
I always say Zax.
Okay, I know Zex. I know the third one is Xer, but I just wanted to be proper. I ain't want nobody in my DMs talking about how uncultured I am. 2004, you had Tekken 5 and Mortal Kombat Deception. 2006, you had Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection. Don't people say that's like one of the best Tekkens of all time? 2007, you had Tekken 6 that came out in Virtual Fighter 5. In 2008, you had Blaze Blue Calamity Trigger. Now, there's just a few games. I didn't even go and add all of them. So basically, 3D games were thriving during this time. You had a top 3 fighting game of all time coming out. You had Guilty Gear holding it down, and you had Blaze Blue come out, and some decent MK games and some decent KOF games. I didn't even add every KOF because it was a KOF every year. Like, so what we talking about? Like,
Yeah.
it was some decent. It was like great games that was coming out during this time. But the reason why I say I get it too is because at the end of the day, Capcom is the pulse of the FGC. Like, where Capcom goes, so does the FGC. That's why it was such a big deal when Capcom was releasing duds from like, Street Fighter Cross Tekken, NBCI's. Like when Capcom does horrible, the scene just like it just make it seem like it's the end of the world. When Capcom is on fire, they make it seem like the scene is just doing fire. Like, let's just be honest. If MVC4 came out and was fire, if another Capcom versus SNK came out and it was fire, along with them being able to keep Street Fighter 6 fire, I mean, people could act like Tekken 8, MK, and all, and Guilty Gear could all go down here. They'll swear the FGC is just popping just because Capcom popping. But like when Capcom ain't doing, I mean, we just know how it is when it comes to Capcom. They basically created the fighting game scene, and when they're doing good, it's just amazing. So I agree, and I don't agree. I don't agree because it was fire games released during those so-called 10 years that it was dead. And then on top, like, but at the same time, like I get it. I get the scene lives and dies by Capcom, but that's how I feel. Like it's poppycock, man. It's a lie, half lie, but I want to say it's a whole lie. Um, you can go ahead, Big Bird. I mean, Mr. Gamer.
Got the yellow on. So I'm gonna start by saying I do think the term Dark Ages it's not a little it's overboard because it's Dark Ages implies that there was literally no game under the umbrella of a fighting game out in this period. And that's just not true. Again, Rexon, he mentioned a lot of good fighting. Tekken 5, I mean, I was definitely playing Tekken 5 during this time. Like I was playing Tekken 5 during the time of me being in high school. Like so I don't, I was playing Tekken, I was playing I even played Virtua Fighter 4.
Really?
The one few times I did play Virtua Fighter, borrowed it from somebody. I didn't buy it. But it was some fighting games. Now I will say I do remember like from King. I didn't play a lot of King of Fighters during this time. Like my first venture into King of Fighters was 13. I might have played a few before then, but like actually sitting down one and really playing it, taking the time to just like dive deep into it, it was 13. There was some game 3D. If anybody remember, the 3D era of KOF began in that era.
Oh, Maximum
Maximum
Impact.
Impact.
Yeah.
Those games were not well received. I know there was still other like the 2D King of Fighters, but there were some games out there that were kind of like a little suspect. Like, I know, like I thought they looked cool, but those 3D games just weren't received well. You even had games like that we don't really talk about a lot, like Bloody Roar. That was a really popular game. Bloody Roar, people still say to this day, man, what's Bloody Roar at, man? Why don't we have a Bloody Roar comeback?
Exactly.
Ditto Live, Ditto Live 2 Hardcore. I was playing that. That was dope. As far as like Street Fighter, I think I was probably still playing Alpha 3 at this time. Alpha 3, then you had the 30th year anniversary, I think, came out around this time, if I'm not mistaken. So you had that one. But yeah, I do think it is kind of one of those things where it's like Capcom kind of dictates, like, what we're doing in terms of like, well, ain't no fighting games out and the Street Fighter out. And it's like one of the most recognizable, if not the most recognizable. So a lot of people in general, like the casual audience might be like, well, there's no new Street Fighter out. So, it ain't no fighting games. It's like, then there's so many other fighting games. I feel like that could be a part of people that weren't really like deep into the FGC. They'll say there's no fighting games because like maybe a popular fighting games are not, but that was fighting games. I played Soul Calibur 2, Soul Calibur 3. Even in 09, Soul Calibur 4. Like,
yep.
Well, I think Soul Calibur 4, I believe it was like 08 or 09, or 08 or 09. I think it kind of came out as we kind of came out of the quote unquote dark ages around Street Fighter 4. But yeah, I don't think that it was a dark age, because that would imply there was no fighting games period. You had Guilty Gear. I played that for the first time, Guilty Gear on PS2. So yeah, I get it. There was like, and I will say one thing that Street Fighter 4 did, it kind of brought us into a new era of like competitiveness. Like the scene exploded, like, and Street Fighter 4 came out. I think that's one thing that it did. And the scene wasn't quite as big and robust as it was before then. So that's one thing I think that's like, I'll give it. It kind of made the scene explode a little more. But to say that it was a dark age, I don't think that's the proper term to use.
Let them know.
So when Rexon, when you used the term "a whole lie" earlier, yeah, I think you had it right. I think, yeah, it's a whole. It is definitely a whole lie. It really is, and even just based on what Mr. Gaming Lift, he just lifted a bunch of video fighting games that came out during that time. It's like, how could you even make up your mouth to say that it was a dark age anyway? I remember during that time. During that time, some of the games were even like marked as their year. You know what I mean? Like, you had King of Fighters 2002, King of Fighters 2003, like King of Fighters, I think 11 came out, I think
11,
around
yeah.
that time, around like 2007, 2008, I think. I mean,
We
I
don't
actually
count
had that
12.
delivered to my house, I think one of the, or you know what? I think I got that one, had that delivered while I was in college. Actually, I was like, oh man, I'm definitely gonna play this game. So I had it delivered in college because I was like, I'm not waiting until I go home to play this game. So I don't know, man. It's like there were a bunch of fighting games like you're talking about the Maximum Impact games. Even though they didn't do that well, I thought they were great. And it really is like this whole thing where it's like, well, Capcom, didn't have a really popular game during that time, so obviously it was the Dark Ages. It's like, how is it the Dark Ages, man? Like, I mean, it's only dark. It's only dark because you had your eyes closed. You weren't looking. Because you had your eyes closed the whole time. Of course, it's going to be dark. You didn't see nothing. So yeah, it's the Dark Ages to you, but in actuality, it was actually pretty boom. I remember when Blaze Blue, what you call it, Calamity Trigger came out. I remember when that dropped, and I was like, wow, this is pretty crazy. It wasn't Guilty Gear, but it wasn't supposed to be. It was its own thing, and it was actually really fun for some people. For others, not so much. And I think when you get to the point where you're basically like, well, there's no Street Fighter that's like really, really like making waves right now. So, oh well, the fighting games just aren't doing that well. It's like, no, because in order for Street Fighter 4 to quote unquote save the scene, there had to have been a scene to save in the first place. You know what I mean? Like, there had to have already been a scene, there had to have been something to save, and there definitely was a scene to save, I guess. So yeah, like it's a bloody roar. I mean, what are we doing here, man? What are we really doing here? I mean, I think what both Tekken 4 and 5 came out in that 10-year span. Like, come on, man. What are we talking about here?
One thing I also want to add is definitely when it comes to like the fighting games and stuff. Well, let me say this first. Nobody's disrespecting Street Fighter 4 because we know how people like to do. You say all this like, man, it wasn't no dark age. Like, so what you saying? Street Fighter 4 had no impact? No, I didn't say that, sir
Oh
or
my
madam.
goodness.
Like, I didn't say that. What I'm saying is we can't just sit here and act like the scene was basically just releasing straight duds like all these years until Street Fighter 4 came out, because that's what basically people would make it seem like, that we was just basically getting duds until they came around. But another thing I'd also like to point out is that when you look at the FGC, and this was like its early days and stuff like that, the early 90s and stuff like that. If you go back and look at history, it wasn't until 2003 that they actually even started letting other games besides Capcom games get into Evo. So like Tekken 2003, I believe, was like the first time we had Tekken Tag, Tekken 4, and Tekken Tag had been when I was like since 1999.
Yep.
So you could tell just from looking at history that the FGC just lived and died by Capcom. Like, why all those years that we had Battle by the Bay and Evo first started off, like the only thing they were playing was Street Fighter and Capcom games. That was it. So of course you could kind of understand from the scene, like just the FGC, not fighting games as a whole, but just the FGC, people just felt like it was the dark ages because, only in the FGC do you hear this term, the dark ages. It's not like, you go, just look in the broader, like, just overall fighting games. Like these companies wouldn't tell you that, like, yeah, fighting games were dead during this time. You probably wouldn't hear Harada admit to that. You wouldn't hear like the Guilty Gear devs and stuff admit to that. Like, what you mean? I was releasing during that time. What you mean a dark age, bro?
Right.
Like, what's up? You gonna throw hands about this? Because you talking greasy out the mouth, you know. So yeah, but just kind of looking at history, you understand. Because like I said, the biggest tournament that we know of wasn't even having games outside of Capcom games until 2003. And is it honest in 3D games, Tekken and is definitely Virtual Fighter and Dead or Alive was out during these times that these Capcom games that people hold in high prestige, they were out at the same time. So why wasn't these 3D fighters getting any love back then? So it is what it is. So like I said, I can understand, but it ain't the truth. So anybody else got any last thing to add?
I mean, like I said, there is a lot of games I think you forget about that sometimes. Well, we forget about as a community. Like I remember Battle Fantasia came out around
Oh
that time
yeah.
period, and again, it wasn't like the most popular thing, but I mean, it was another fighting game that came out. It was about, if I'm not mistaken, it was supposed to be like a Third Strike kind of type game, like spiritual successor, so to speak. But it was made by, if I'm not mistaken, Arxis, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken.
Yeah, I think you're right about
Um,
that.
yeah, Battle Fantasia. I mean, maybe people don't remember this one, but Fight Maker. Anybody remember Fighter Maker? It
Yeah.
was it wasn't the best game. It was a fighting game. They were trying something unique. So yeah, there was a lot of fighting games that kind of just like get caught up in the big three of history. Like if you're around that big bowling ball of Tekken, Mortal Kombat, and Street Fighter, and then like there's a few other outliers like Marvel vs. Capcom, some other ones. You just get caught up in this massive ball of stuff, and it's just like you kind of forget about them. But I remember Battle Fantasia, Arcana Heart, I think it came out around that time.
Yeah,
So
that's exactly what I was thinking of, Arcana
yeah,
Heart.
yeah, that was fighting games. But like I said, I do think that Street Fighter 4 came when I think the Dark Age more so relates to the scene, like competitive wise, like how popular it was, uh, the growth that it had at the time. Because Street Fighter 4 came out, and it's almost like immediately, like I didn't even really know and follow tournaments and stuff in the scene until Street Fighter 4 came out. I didn't really know that was a thing until Street Fighter 4 came out. So I do think that that game is what kind of led to like people like having more of a lens on like, okay, this is a competitive scene for it. They started doing tournaments. We got these thing majors now. They're doing streaming. That was like that whole nucleus was popular at the time, and it just came together, and that's what Street Fighter 4 did. But yeah, again, like just Dark Ages, like that would imply there was like one or two fighting games out, period. Like did anybody even knew about? And I mean, again, we got to give like games like Soul Calibur their respect, like Soul Calibur 2, Soul Calibur 3. Those were
Mad disrespect.
really, really good games. Like those are like household names. So it's like we can't say games like that are out. And it's like I know 3 was okay. It wasn't quite like 2, but it was still a decent game. So it's like that's out. Like I played it in the arcades. So I don't know, you know.
Man, I don't know who was playing Soul Calibur 2 back then and talking about, man, fighting games stale, man. What we gonna do? Capcom save us.
Man,
I don't know who was doing that.
Yeah, bro. I remember everybody I knew in like in high school, everybody I knew was playing that. I was like on the wrestling team. Like that's actually all we played. Actually, we would go to like wrestling meets, and we would have like we would bring a TV, like a CRT TV, with us to wrestling meets. You know, it's like a bunch of different teams there. So you're waiting your turn. So we would just set up in a corner, and like we'd have like Street Fighter Alpha 3, Soul Calibur 2, I think it was Mortal Kombat, Deception, Deadly Alliance. I can't remember which one.
Y'all had
You
a
know,
lineup, boy.
Guilty Gear X2. We had what's called Dragon Ball Z, Budokai. You know, other teams would see us playing game, and they would all show up, and there'd be this big crowd of people just like, oh man, like yo, let me get a turn. You know, it was like, I mean, there were so many fighting games around that time, so it's kind of like, what are you talking about? That there's a dark. It's really really strange to me, and I wanted to say another thing about Street Fighter 4. Just and this was my opinion. I thought when
That's all
Street
you
Fighter
about to be
4 came out,
disrespectful.
it was kind of dull, to be honest. Like the first one, like the vanilla Street Fighter 4, it was kind of dull. You know, I mean, it was like, oh, great, there's a Street Fighter out, but it wasn't real. It was like, I don't think that Street Fighter 4 became really all that like great in my mind until they released like, like what was it like Super Street Fighter 4 or whatever, when they had like Guy and Cody and Adon and everybody in it. Like I don't think it really became anything in my mind, anything of note until that time. Because
It's
then
about the
at that
version
point,
2011 update, if I remember correctly.
what'd you say?
Devin know better than I would know which
I want to
update
say
that
you're
was.
wrong, but it had guy in it, so I can't say you're wrong.
You know, like I was like, wow, like because I was like, oh, okay, this is cool, but I mean, it was more or less like, I mean, who, like, what new
You would
characters
you
were
you
in the
didn't like
game?
Sagat Fighter 4, man?
Huh?
You didn't like Sagat Fighter 4 when it
Yeah,
came out?
right. Yeah, exactly, right. Like it was like, oh, okay, this is cool. Yeah, it's all right, man. This is good. And then, but man, when they were like, oh yeah, we're putting Cody and Guy and Ibuki and like Adon in the game, and it's like, what? Like you guys are going crazy right now. So I mean, I think that's honestly to me when I felt like that's when Street Fighter 4 really started popping off. And I feel like, you know, Street Fighter 4 Vanilla, just to me, just kind of based on name mostly, was what like kind of carried it, you know? Not to say that it was a bad game, but in terms of like popularity, it's like, oh wow, it's another Street Fighter game. Not necessarily, oh my gosh, this is a mind-blowing fighting game. When, there were other fighting games around that time that were as good or even in some ways better than Street Fighter 4. So
Well,
yeah.
not lie, the marketing for Street Fighter 4 when it first came out was just so amazing. Just like it had been so long since a Street Fighter. Like that theme music, man, that opening theme music, like the like the
You're coming
opening
over me. I can feel it
the
all
opening
around
cinematic
me.
and stuff like that. It's like when you saw that, you was just like, I don't even know if the game good, but here go $50.
Oh yeah,
Like
I definitely was.
like just from the marketing, it was just like, oh, like, and you just threw some money at whoever was the nearest like game outlet. Like it was amazing. Um, so and yeah, people got into it, and of course, with a lot of fighting games, you get into like its original launch version, and people was just kind of like, "Ooh, this is a little rough," but at the end of the day, it was still Street Fighter, even though Sagat was running the world. which I ain't mad about. I mean, it's a guy. I mean, I ain't tripping too much. And then he got super nerfed. Uh, but yeah, and definitely when you start getting the Ultra Street Fighter, like it got better as it aged. But then next thing you know, towards the end of its life cycle, it seemed like everything just started going wrong after Street Fighter Cross Tekken messed up. Because then next thing you know, they released Selena and Street Fighter 4, and everybody was just like, yeah, so when 5 coming out? By the time we got to the end of 4, everybody was just, same old routine. Like, oh, when the next one coming out?
I played
Well,
against a friend when she came out, and I played like 5 matches against him. I was like, oh yeah, she's top tier. He's like, no, she's not. I don't think she's that bad. I'm like, remember this in a few years. Remember this.
yeah, the
I
only thing
know
you
what
was
I be
hearing
talking
in
about.
tournaments was healing
Healing.
and that reach for the sky. Yeah, it was getting spammed a lot. I remember I was watching the Justin Wong and Min RD video. One of the questions he had for Min RD was like, "So you was a dirty Alina player, huh?" And it's like people really couldn't stand that girl. But hopefully she don't get that bad of a rep in Street Fighter 6. So